Hello everyone, today I've got something a little different planned from what I normally do. So there's been a bit of a lull of new releases lately, and I'm kind of just waiting for Resident Evil, which will be my next review. So to fill gaps like this, I want to start a new series, I guess, where I'm going to go back and talk about some older games, trying to avoid games that pretty much everyone unanimously loved, like for example the Battlefront series, or any other franchise that's still getting reboots or sequels today. Instead, I want to use these videos as a chance to bring attention to games I don't think got enough attention when they were new. So instead of explaining to you what I mean by this, I'm going to show you what I mean with our first video in this series, Dragon's Dogma. Now to be fair, there is a reason this didn't get as much attention as it deserved, and that's because it had its fair share of shortcomings that would turn players off just starting out. However, it brought some revolutionary gameplay mechanics to the table, things that we haven't seen in any other games after this. Developers these days, after all, like to replicate success, and this game just wasn't successful. But it wasn't the fault of the new ideas they tried to add to the game. Now, I'm going to treat these videos in this series just like I would a normal review, except I'll probably touch on things like why it failed and stuff like I just did. That being said, let's get to discussing this game. So let's start strong here with the big question. Why do I think this game is so revolutionary? Now don't get me wrong, there's plenty of other reasons to like the game as well, which I'll talk about in a second, but the biggest thing this game does right is its combat. In comparison to other games, it's like a mixture of Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter, Shadow of the Colossus, and even just a little bit of Dark Souls. And they mix all these elements of combat together in a way that's both simple and in-depth. Now in normal combat against other humanoid enemies, you have an excellent variety of abilities that are easy to use but still serve a unique purpose in battle, with an intuitive control system that makes it so you don't have to bind 5,000 different buttons to different abilities, and the ability for two spellcasters to sync up their spells together and unleash devastating boss-killing attacks. And while that's all well and good and it makes for fun combat against smaller enemies, the part of Dragon's Dogma's combat that makes it really revolutionary comes into play more so against your bosses, which this game does better than any other game out there. Where most games would try to shove a quick time event or a scripted cutscene down your throat when you're trying to climb on top of a big monster, this game instead lets you do all of that yourself. You press the grab button when you're close to a boss, and then you have complete control over where you're climbing on top of the enemy, when and where to attack, and putting you in control of these intense cinematic moments is something we never saw in titles before this, and something we still haven't seen in titles since then. And even had they not included this mechanic, we'd still be left with some of the best boss battles we've seen in any other game. With the final boss fight against the dragon being ranked up there among my favorite boss battles of all time. An almost half-hour long multi-tiered fight, intense cinematic moments that leave you in control, all of it building up to an amazingly done final phase where you're pit against the dragon on a level playing field as equals, which also introduces you to the mechanics for fighting minor dragons which show up in the post-game. And after that fight's done, the story kicks it up to 11 with all kinds of hidden truths and twists being revealed, which makes everything leading up to it so worth it. And then, as if the fight wasn't cool enough, the entire fight is accompanied by a truly epic soundtrack. And it's not just for this boss fight either. While this game has plenty of beautiful, relaxing soundtracks for out of combat, which we've actually been seeing a lot more of lately, every intense fight in Dragon's Dogma is accompanied by its own equally intense soundtrack, which on the other hand is something we haven't seen quite as much of lately. And as I sort of mentioned before, there's still more to play after you beat the dragon. Of course, the option's always available to you to go into New Game Plus with all the experience and items you've collected from your previous run, and there's even some little tiny tweaks to the ending that happen in New Game Plus, which obviously I'm not going to spoil in this video. But there's also a post-game that's unlocked after you beat the dragon, which you could theoretically play forever, which can be pretty addicting, but the real highlight of this primary post-game is the badass dragon fight, which is sort of a huge meta boss which implements some online mechanics, where the dragon has an absolutely enormous health pool, and you can only fight him for a limited time every attempt. But every single person playing the game is seeing the same health pool you're seeing, and everyone who deals damage to the dragon is dealing damage to the same health bar. And while I would have preferred to actually be fighting with other people, I always thought this idea was unique and addicting. And then with the Dark Arisen re-release of the game, they added yet another post-game zone. And while this new zone is accessible right from the beginning of the game, its story doesn't make much sense unless you've already beaten the game, and it features insane challenges clearly intended for players who've already conquered the previous post-game. And just like the Everfall has the Dragon, this new zone has its own meta boss in the form of Death, who makes totally random appearances as you go deeper into the island, has an incredibly large health pool, and just like the Dragon will retreat after a while of fighting him. While it's missing the same online components that the Dragon has, the randomness of these encounters makes the entire experience chilling and creepy. And all in all, throughout most of the game, and then as you get to the post-game and then to Bitter Black Isle, the game's difficulty increases in these sort of waves, but it still gives you plenty of time to get used to the waves of difficulty, so that you'll still get immense satisfaction from conquering the more difficult challenges, without having a difficulty curve that's too gradual for you to notice it changing. And the next unique feature this game introduces is the pawn system. In addition to creating your own character, you also create your own personal pawn. This pawn will serve as your companion throughout your adventures, and you also have the ability to recruit 2 other pawns from other players, allowing you to recruit pawns from your friends, and even trade some items to your friends through their pawn. And whenever you rest, your pawn will come back with items and experience from helping players in their own worlds, and you'll even get to hear what other players thought of your pawn's performance. And if you don't care for allowing other players to hire your pawn, you can turn that off if you want. And the last major innovation that Dragon's Dogma brings to the table is the vocation system. The vocations serve as sort of your classes in the game, but the unique twist about vocations is that you can change it at any time by going to the town hub. From the innkeeper there, you can unlock new classes or switch to a class you already own, and while your character does have an overall level that increases regardless of what class you're playing, each class also has its own separate rank which unlocks more unique and powerful abilities, really allowing you to switch classes at any time regardless of how far into the game you are, allowing you to play around and experiment with every class and let you decide which one you want to play with in the long run. And now, while we're done talking about the huge innovations the game brought to the table, those are far from the only things that Dragon's Dogma does right. First of all, with the PC launch of the game, we have mod support. And thank God for that, because it was often hard to find armors that fit exactly what you wanted to look like. While the modding community is small and the most common thing you see is nude mods and super slutty armors, but thankfully it's fairly easy to create your own texture mods if you have an idea in mind. And it's something that took me completely off guard in this game because I did not expect Capcom to allow this kind of thing. While it's not quite on the level of Skyrim mods, being mostly limited to texture changes much like Dark Souls, is still an excellent, much welcome addition to the game. And as far as the game's standard features, it has a really nice treasure hunting, exploration, and even a little bit of parkour mechanics going on, which works together so well with the exploration and treasure hunting, allowing the developers to hide little hidden treasures up in places that you might not be able to reach with a less mobile class. And while you're out there exploring, you have to actually be somewhat wary of the game's day-night cycle, as more dark enemies like zombies show up at night. And added to that, there's a higher likelihood of more dangerous enemies like chimeras showing up at night. And not to mention, of course, your obscured vision from the darkness, making it so you have to rely on your lantern and limited amounts of oil you find in the game, which adds just a bit more much welcome atmosphere to the day-night cycle. But it's still always worth it to explore because they always hide not only treasures but even little just sort of flavor things added to the environment, like a friendly Cyclops in his pit for example, and sometimes even little side quests that you might not have found if you didn't explore. And later on in the game, you'll start getting met with more dynamic encounters with large monsters like griffins. And every time this happens, it serves as its own epic boss fight in and of itself. Now when the game launched, it had a huge problem with the lack of fast travel, and yeah, there were still port crystals and fairy stones which are in the game now, but those items that you needed for fast travel were way too rare, making it so you had to run around everywhere you went, and the stamina system for travel was absolute garbage. But the Dark Arisen re-release of the game directly addressed these issues by adding new items like the Eternal Fairy Stone, which is given to the player right at the start and acts as a reusable fairy stone, so that you can now fast travel whenever you want to. And they've also added more lootable port crystals in more obvious places throughout the map, so that even players who don't venture too far off the beaten path can find port crystals and put them down to use in fast travel. While it's not a perfect system for fast travel, it still works just fine by allowing you to get from point A to point B quickly, which you couldn't efficiently do before Dark Arisen. If Mass Effect's biggest problem was that it was an amazing journey with a terrible conclusion, then Dragon's Dogma has the exact opposite problem with its story. While the game's story starts off very strong with its opening moments, everything between that point and when you fight the dragon is totally disinteresting. Every character you meet has the personality of a sponge, nothing meaningful ever happens, so instead of advancing the plot, you're just being sent out on chores by the Duke. And when the plot twists do happen, it's stuff you've seen coming since the very beginning. And yet the cutscenes for the game still treat these twists like they're some kind of huge deal we could never have expected. Meanwhile, in the beginning of the game, they're directly showing you who's gonna turn traitor. And while there are one or two main quests that are still pretty cool, every single side quest, as well as even a majority of the main quests, just end up being almost completely flat and boring. And this isn't helped by some of the flat and grainy color palettes chosen for the graphics throughout the game. It makes the overall graphical quality for the game, which already doesn't have the best graphics in the world, look even worse still than if they'd just chosen some more saturated textures. Next, while the grappling system is great, the camera angles are uncontrollable while you're holding on to larger creatures. You'd think it would have been just common sense to allow you to control your own camera while you're climbing on top of large monsters. But instead, you're at the mercy of where the game wants to point the camera. So when the game gives you a bad camera angle, it becomes more a fight against the camera than the monster. Next, another problem with the game is its inventory management. Now, I don't mean necessarily the encumbrance rating, which I don't really have any strong feelings towards one way or the other, but rather the need to pause combat and sift through your inventory whenever you need to use a consumable. Now, fortunately, if you're a PC player on mouse and keyboard, you can keybind some consumables and your lantern to the 1 through 5 keys, but you're shit out of luck if you either play on a console or a PC with a controller, since if you want to use a consumable in combat, you're going to have to pause the action and sift through your inventory and find it. And even if you're a mouse and keyboard player, the 1 through 5 keys are limited only to curatives and your lantern. So if you're hoping to bind tools like the fairy stone to one of those keys, well, sorry, you can't do that. This inventory management also ties in with a lazily done crafting system. It's simple, thankfully, and you just press the combine button on a certain item and it gives you a list of options of stuff you can combine it with. But unlike with the combat, the simplicity of the crafting system is ultimately its downfall. Not to mention you can't even use the crafting system to make yourself weapons or armor, it's strictly limited to tools and curatives. And then next, outside of combat, the pawns just talk way too much, calling out pointless shit over and over as you're exploring the world. Thankfully though, with the Dark Arisen release, they added a solution to this problem by allowing you to turn off pawn chatter in the settings. Which, to clarify, doesn't stop your pawns from calling out the truly important stuff, which I think is a good thing, and it just silences their repetitive callouts. Also, the pawns are missing options for a lot of the classes available in the game, only able to choose from the basic and advanced versions of the classes, being unable to pick from the hybrid vocations like the magic archer or the assassin. And lastly, healing spells, while incredibly useful in early game, lose their potency incredibly quickly as you level up, since they don't scale with your character level or vocation level. Now, I don't have a problem with the limit to how much it can heal before needing to use a curative, but more so my problem is with just how little healing spells actually heal, and how you have to be standing in the healing circle in order to gain the healing effect. I just wish that the healing power scaled as you got higher level, and that you could have the heals follow your character or your pawns instead of being stuck in a certain place on the ground. First of all, if they were really intent to make this a single-player RPG, they should have more easily allowed players the option to go out on their own without pawns at all. While there is a perk that will give you a ton of bonuses if you venture out without any pawns, it only becomes available after you've spent plenty of time leveling up the assassin class. I feel like this is too much of a barrier for people who just want to go it alone. Two things should be done with this perk. One, and most obviously, I think it should be made available for any class right from the start of the game. And two, I think it needs to be reworked so that instead of just giving you flat bonuses if you have no pawns active, make it so the bonus itself is less potent, but it multiplies the more pawns you dismiss from your party. This would mean it would not only be a viable option for people who want to go without pawns entirely, but also an option for people who only want to go with their main pawn and don't want to hire any extra pawns from other players. Next, who the hell says this has to be a single player RPG? Some co-op for this game could have gone a long way. Hell, they could have used the Rift, which is the place where you summon pawns from, as sort of a multiplayer lobby, where you can invite your friends to play with you while you're in the Rift, and upon leaving they'll take the place of one of your support pawns, and if you invite 3 friends they'll even replace your main pawn. That just would have been so badass, and if they had done that I would encourage everyone I know to get this game. And then on the topic of multiplayer, I feel like the Dragon should have been an enormous multiplayer event. It would have been so cool if you could go into the Dragon's lair, and then you'd see 3 or 4 Arisen and all their pawns already fighting the dragon. Maybe not every single player who's fighting the Dragon, but maybe just 2 or 3 other people. So then you can jump into the fray in the middle of the fight. Not only would that be fucking amazing, but it also help with this sense they're trying to deliver already that you're not the only person fighting this Dragon. However, I don't necessarily think that shared health pool mechanic should be wasted, but rather that it should be given to Death in Bitter Black Isle instead. And having that mechanic would help deliver the feeling that Death is this mysterious death-dealing creature, traveling through different worlds and trying to reap the souls of other Arisen. And lastly, while there are some dynamic encounters like griffins and cyclopses that happen in random locations, the same can't be said for the weaker monsters and bandits in the game who are always gonna spawn in the same locations every time you go there. While it serves just fine for your first playthrough, it'll get really repetitive on subsequent playthroughs. So it'd really help with the game's longevity if they just randomized some of the spawn locations of these smaller mobs, or randomized what mobs spawned in each location. Just would have made the non-boss encounters a lot more interesting. So all things considered, it's time to give my rating for the game, but I'm not done discussing it quite yet, so stay tuned after the rating. And yeah, while this game does a lot fantastically, it also has a lot of shortcomings, so I'm gonna have to give the ultimate rating of a 8 out of 10. There's some truly revolutionary stuff going on here, and for that alone I would recommend picking this game up just to see how boss battles should be done in RPGs. But of course, like I've said and talked about, the game has plenty of shortcomings, so I don't think it's quite award worthy, but it could have been if they had just done some things a little differently. Now this game's already been out for quite a long time, so at this point anything I've talked about that hasn't already been fixed is probably never gonna get fixed. So what do I want from this game? Do I want a sequel? Do I want a reboot, a spiritual successor? See, the thing is, this game already got a sequel. An MMO even. Problem is, it was only released in Japan. Now thankfully I have been able to play this thanks to a tutorial on Reddit that showed you how to download it through a VPN and get it working, and install translation patches so that some of the stuff is in English. But unfortunately, just because of the sheer volume of text needed to be translated, the translation patch doesn't really catch everything. Although even not being able to understand half the stuff that's being said or written, I can at least tell you this much. Not only have they managed to retain the same combat formula as the previous game, they've even managed to improve upon it with a ton more abilities and actions you can perform, in addition to actually fixing a lot of the problems that plagued the first game. So what I want from Dragon's Dogma, all I want really, is to get full US and EU releases. And before anyone says, but Murloc, Capcom MMOs never come to the US. Just take a look at the Monster Hunter MMO for example. To those people, first of all, I would like to remind you that the original Dragon's Dogma was made for Western audiences specifically, so it would only make sense for them to release this in the US and EU as well. And second of all, while there haven't been any official plans or announcement about this game coming to the US, they have hinted that they want to bring this game overseas once they have a solid base in Japan, to tap into the huge market here for online games. So naysay all you want, but I think there's a good chance we're going to see a US and EU release of this sometime in the future. And from what I've played of this game, I'm extremely confident that this could be Capcom's huge moneymaker, their ace in the hole. And while I understand how expensive it can be to set up servers for an MMO, and since the game's still trying to get a solid base in Japan, It would be a risky and expensive endeavor for them to expand, but I think it's a risk that would definitely pay off big time for Capcom, especially now that developers have sort of given up on trying to usurp World of Warcraft, and the MMORPG market isn't as bloated as it used to be. They really wouldn't have too much competition, and personally I'd be willing to give up my World of Warcraft subscription for this game if it had a full US launch. Hell, even with half the game in Japanese and the huge server disconnect with the distance, I still find myself spending a huge portion of my free time playing this game. So please Capcom, if you like money, and I know you do, you cheeky fuckers, please release this game in the US and EU. I've seen what the game has to offer, and I'm confident that the world will thank you for it if you do. It's a truly revolutionary game with not only the best combat seen in an MMO before, but also the best combat seen in any RPG before. Until then though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
You alright, mister? Take care, you want so good water. Fine.